Welcome once again to Along the Rio Grande. I'm George Torok, and today we have in our studio Dietmar Hector-Schneider. It's always a pleasure when we can talk to one of our adjunct instructors and find out a little bit of the work that they've been involved in. And he's going to tell us today about some of his work in environmental history. Dietmar, welcome to Along the Rio Grande.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me.
Sure. Maybe we can start out by talking a little bit about your background, how you got interested in history, what kinds of activities you've been involved in.
As far as sort of getting interested in history, it actually sort of came from just a love of reading as a young fellow. I enjoyed literature, especially the old Robert Louis Stevenson books, the Ivanhoe, Sir Walter Scott. So really, reading was really the key to moving into the sort of the love of history.
And how did you decide to study history as a field?
It was perhaps the most comfortable academic arena I was in when I was taking courses. And from there, just made contacts with certain instructors, professors, and they sort of helped guide me in particular directions.
Where have you studied?
Well, my first college was Moorpark College in California, and then as far as the sort of the university direction, that would be Austin Peay State University out there in Clarksville, Tennessee, New Mexico State University, and then Texas Tech in Lubbock.
And what general areas attracted your attention? What things did you study?
My principal focus as far as the original thesis, was on the Apache Scouts in the Southwest. So I found an interest there looking at sort of a unique Army unit that for the most part was generally ignored as far as their contributions to sort of pacifying as far as the federal government was concerning the West.
And where were they?
They were principally out of Fort Bayard, Fort Bowie, sort of along the New Mexico, Arizona.
And they were kind of
border.
Ignored in the traditional
In the traditional literature, yeah. So.
And at some point you got interested in this broad field of environmental history?
Correct. That came about as a result of working under the guidance of Dr. Dan Flores at Texas Tech. He's principally an environmentalist with an emphasis on Texas history. And I came under his wing, and he directed me into, the institutional history focus of environmental history, and that would have been directed towards the National Park Service.
So you ended up taking a look at sort of how the federal government is involved in managing and the environment, using the environment to some extent.
Yes.
Let's talk about what environmental history is. Is this something that comes out of the environmental movement, or is it something different? How would we define environmental history?
Well, environmental history is it's pretty multifaceted arena. It has a lot to do with the particular historian and what the focus is for that historian. It's sort of the heart of environmental history. It has to look at the human interaction with the earth, the particular landscape, how we've lived in it, how we've tilled it, what we've done to it, whether sort of in a positive or in a negative sense, and how we've just interacted with it.
Is this a new field, or have we had sort of a tradition of environmental history?
Well, if we're looking at what you would say are the philosophical roots of what would evolve into the environmental movement, it would probably be pinpointed to the Transcendentalist movement of the 1830s and 40s with Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and certainly one of their important proteges, John Muir, near the end of the century out in California.
There's a connection with environmental and Western history. What's the crossover there?
I think a lot of that has to do really in the sort of the transcendentalist thinking that because the United States had reached the Pacific, it was a sort of an awakening, a wake-up call for Americans that our natural resources weren't infinite any longer. We'd reached the end of the mountain range, so to speak. And these transcendentalists what you would say, would take the approach that we need to recognize the finite aspect of our natural resources, and observing what had happened on the East Coast, where the forests had been devastated, the streams, the rivers had been polluted, urban pollution. If we went or continued at the same rate, the future wouldn't be very bright.
So many of the environmental studies have focused more on the West than the East because of that?
Well, because I believe the reason for that is that this is where positive change could be made before the damage actually was inflicted.
I see.
I believe that would be the thinking of it.
When we're taking a look at the field of environmental history, is that connected to the environmental movement that we think of coming out of the 1950s and 60s? Is there some crossover there?
Well, when you look at sort of the heritage, you know, the lineage of the environmental movement, you would have to go back to the conservation movement, really sort of emerging with John Muir, who would be sort of in the preservationist mode of a conservationist. Ironically, at the same time, while you had Muir as a preservationist wanting to preserve and maintain things as they were without damage or inflicting the environment, the forests, the U.S. Forestry Division had been created, and its head was a fellow by the name of Chief Forester. His name was Gifford Pinchot. And while he's considered a conservationist, he would be in the mode of a utilitarian conservationist. He subscribed to is that our natural resources are there to be used, but they need to be used and managed wisely, scientifically, as he would refer to it.
So they kind of lay the basis for a debate that is still ongoing
Correct.
today about federal lands and parks, monuments, etc.
That's correct. Now, when you think about certainly the involvement of the environmental movement, it's really going to have its origins in sort of the 50s controversy in Dinosaur National Monument, whether we should dam it or not. Okay. The real environmentalism sort of really erupted with the hectic 60s, with all the different movements that were taking place, the unrest on the college campuses, and certainly 22 April 1970 Earth Day.
Earth Day.
And that really is sort of the watershed or watermark for the beginning of the modern environmental movement.
Take us through the development of the federal use of land and the federal setting aside of land. We think of national parks, we think of all of these areas being designated around the turn of the last century. How does this begin? When is our first national park, or is there something that really takes place before
really
that?
One of our, what you'll say, first reservations, or sometimes they refer to just as reserves by the federal government, was Hot Springs in Arkansas, the mineral spas there. And this really sort of laid the groundwork that the Secretary of the Interior did have, what you would say, the authority to begin reserving certain tracts out of the public domain. Okay. When we look at what would evolve into the first national parks, certainly through the efforts of William Henry Jackson, the famous photographer, Albert Bierstadt, and Thomas Moran, the important artists portraying the Rockies, and certainly the byproduct of the Hayden and the King and the Wheeler and the Powell expeditions. Congress realized that there were certain areas worth setting aside, and also through the efforts of John Muir, they were able to convince Congress that a place called Yellowstone was worthy of being set aside, as they referred to it, as a pleasuring ground for future generations.
And when was this taking place?
That would be 1872. And so that would be the U.S.'s first national park.
And what's a pleasuring ground? Do they explain exactly what this is going to be or how it's going to be used?
Right. The language is a bit vague exactly what pleasuring ground means. But what it is clearly understood in the language, in contrast to the national forests that had been created, that there would be no harvesting of the forests. this would be well regulated, well managed, and to be preserved in the Muir tradition rather than in the Pinchot tradition.
How do we get monuments, reserves? What's the evolution of that? What's first? And
Yeah, well, to sort of lay the groundwork for what would become the national monument category, in the 1880s and 90s, what we had were lots of archaeologists, anthropologists sort of crawling all around the American Southwest. And what they discovered is many of the ancient dwelling sites had been looted, they had been vandalized. And so really what you had is sort of the impetus by the archaeological community putting pressure through their connections in Washington, D.C., that perhaps these places need to have some federal protection.
Oh, I see.
And with a conservation-minded president such as Theodore Roosevelt, it would be Roosevelt in 1906 that was able to convince Congress to pass what was called an Act for the Preservation of American Antiquities, commonly known as the Antiquities Act. And this would be the act that would create the National Monument category. What was special about it, in contrast to, say, the National Park category, national parks, it takes what you would say an act of Congress. In other words, it's a very slow-moving process. Sure. Whereas the National Monument category, all it took was to catch the president's ear and his signature, and then you had a proclamation.
What were some of the early national monuments?
Yeah, some of the early national monuments, one of the ironies about the National Monument category is that while it was intended to preserve what were called the cliff dwellers, okay, their sites, the first national monument was Devil's Tower in Wyoming, a geological site. So what was apparent, certainly in the language of the Monument Act and its, what you would say, usage, is that national monuments could be composed of a variety of different features. They could be as small as 1 acre in size to 2 million acres in size.
Wow.
And so that would be exemplified as recently as President Clinton with the large monumental proclamations in Utah.
And there's some changes that come about late 19-teens into the 1920s in the way that the system evolves.
Right. Here we've got national parks and we've got national monuments. The federal government early on realized that locals as well as tourists enjoyed taking things home with them from their visits. So the U.S. Army would be perhaps the first force that would be designated to help protect Yellowstone. When it comes to the issue of the national monuments, usually what you have is either one of neglect, or they would hire local chambers of commerce individuals, usually at $1 a month, to periodically visit the national monument to make sure it still resided there. No one had taken the entire area. So the issue of protection was on the sort of on the mind of many prominent individuals. And what we had by 1915 was sort of a snowballing movement that had originated at Yellowstone, several conferences in 1911. And by 15, it was understood that something needed to be done that would be more comprehensive, provide better protection for these federal areas. And in 1916, what we had was what was called the National Park Service Organic Act, and this allowed for the creation of the National Park Service, and it went into effect the following year, and its first director would be Stephen Mather, a billionaire. And of course, ironically, this would coincide with America's entry into the First World War, the European conflict, which meant appropriations weren't forthcoming. And of course, Mather would provide almost the entire budget for the first 2 years for the Park Service.
Now, you've written a very interesting study of one particular national monument, one very close to our area here, White Sands. Right. Let's talk a little bit about how that becomes a national monument. What's the interest there? Who is it that creates interest in it?
Yeah, White Sands really has what you would say sort of a unique history. It had been included in several other areas. To kind of give you an idea, in 1898, what we had were some very prominent El Pasoans taking an interest in the Sacramento Range region. And of course, the leading figure was a fellow by the name of Albert Bacon Fall. Okay, as a senator from New Mexico, later he had proposed what was called the All-Year National Park. Okay, and excuse me, at the time he was a judge. Later, after 12, when he was a U.S. Senator, he would resurrect this plan for an all-year national park. And what this potential park would include was Elephant Butte, the reservoir, the entire White Sands region, the gypsum dunes, as well as the lava flow in Valley of Fires today. There would be a major road connecting all of the sites, and to sort of round out this all-year national park, there would be 2,000 selected areas of the Mescalero Apache Reservation, which, of course, the central focus would be Sierra Blanca itself. Okay. These were repeated efforts in '98 and then through the teens by Fall, both as a judge and then as a U.S. Senator, to bring something to southern New Mexico. So that sort of reflects the originally territorial and then later state divisions within New Mexico between the northerners and the southerners in the state.
So how does it actually catch the attention of the federal government? When is there a real move to make it a monument?
What we have, certainly when Fall became Secretary of the Interior, he had made one last-ditch effort to bring this area as a national park.
And this would be in the 1920s?
Beginning in 22 is when he proposed it, and then of course it fizzled entirely by the end of 22. He resigned effective March in 23. And of course when he left office, the investigation into Teapot Dome had begun, which meant that any connection that Fall had with the All-Year National Park would be, what you would say, ignored.
Sure.
Okay, they would shy away from it. And what you had was sort of a period here where boosterism really faded, but a prominent sort of local Alamogordo individual emerges to sort of resurrect the idea of White Sands as some federal preserve. And this was a fellow by the name of Tom Charles.
I'm sorry, Tom Charles. Why White Sands in particular, of all those different areas that you mentioned?
Well, White Sands as a gypsum dune field had always been a very popular picnic spot for the local communities, La Luz, Tularosa, Alamogordo, and even Las Cruces, and periodically El Pasoans would venture up there to have a great weekend.
And what's unique or interesting about that area?
Well, certainly the composition, the gypsum itself, okay, which is rather unique. It's the largest gypsum field in the world. And besides the local interest, okay, there was also the potential that this could provide jobs for hauling gypsum out of the dune area to manufacture alabaster for houses, which had been used in the area to line the insides, the interiors.
And he's successful. When does it become a national monument?
Okay. Through what you would say his lobbying efforts, his connections, on the 18th of January, 1933, President Herbert Hoover proclaimed White Sands as a national monument. And of course, this took place in Hoover's last couple of months before he left office, before he surrendered to Roosevelt.
Now, the original monument undergoes some changes or some challenges as we get into the 1940s. What kinds of problems or conflicts develop there?
For the most part, when you think about the White Sands National Monument itself, through the 30s, it was really what you say, the problems with appropriations, trying to secure a ranger force to assist Charles. Okay, 39, Charles retires, and what we have is a new custodian come in, his name is John Will Ferris. And he would, what you would say, really instill a little bit of professionalism into the staff. In other words, he's a national park man.
Oh, I see.
Okay, unlike he's not a local Chamber of
Right.
Commerce person. And Ferris's first real hurdles would be dealing with World War II, okay? Because not only would he end up losing part of his ranger force, okay, he would also have to deal with the arrival of the military into the Tularosa Basin. The Army Air Service, originally in modern area of Holloman Air Force Base, and all of a sudden the great troop increase at Fort Bliss, Texas.
And
Okay.
what kinds of challenges does this present for protecting a national monument?
Well, what you had was the military thought the dunes were a great place to run their tracks. They're for armored personnel carriers. There would be B-24 landings inside the dune field, as well as rocket impacts, okay, when they were testing after, what you would say, from 46 on. And of course, what the custodian said, whether they were intentional or unintentional, they were still there. And the key for the custodian was trying to preserve the integrity of this federal area.
And Trinity Site and the testing, does that have an impact on the national monument as well?
Well, Trinity Site, today it's part of, comes under the administrative control of the National Park Service, but the site itself is within the confines of White Sands Missile Range, which means that whenever the superintendent today at White Sands, if they want to see their administrative, what you would say, site, they need to ensure that they receive permission from the military. But Trinity Site itself is not technically part of the monument. It's just under the administrative control of it.
Now, when we think of a national park or national monument, we think of something that's been pretty much preserved, or it's the way that it's always been. But I understand with White Sands there's been some environmental impact over time, that there's been some changes introduced, intentionally, unintentionally.
Right. Well, certainly when you think about the dunes themselves, the idea of preserving a geological area, the irony is that the Park Service would have to deal with some, what you'll say, non-indigenous introductions here, and this would be what was called the introduction of the salt cedar or the tamaracks, and the basically wild flora that was originally intended in the Southwest to help preserve and hold riverbanks. And this is what you usually see along some of the arroyos occasionally.
Right.
And for White Sands, this would be usually found out at a site called Lost River within the monument. In 1969, we had the introduction of the African aurochs, a long pronghorned animal. And of course, with the monument not having any fencing, etc., the aurochs, of course, wandered throughout the monument, much sometimes to the pleasure or displeasure of the tourists who were visiting. So what you had was an ongoing process by the Park Service to try to keep the aurochs out of the monument boundaries.
And from some of your work on White Sands, Pinkley has caught your attention, and you've done a little bit more work on him. Maybe we can talk about him briefly.
Okay. Frank Pinkley is a sort of a very interesting character, at least I found out. He first arrived in the Southwest in 1900 from Missouri, and he came out for his health reasons. And through his connections, his had an uncle who happened to be the commissioner of what was BLM, land commissioner in Arizona. His uncle asked him if he would like to be a custodian at Casa Grande ruins. That was then under the control of the GLO, the General Land Office, and he agreed. And out of this early, what you would say, relationship with the General Land Office and as custodian, he would eventually make his connections with the National Park Service. When that agency finally sort of begins to mushroom, and he catches the attention of Stephen Mather, Horace Albright, Arno Kammerer, sort of the heavyweights within the Park Service.
And what does he bring that's different?
Well, he he would be the first, what you say, live-in custodian. He actually resided at the ruins. He engaged in stabilization projects to make sure that the walls didn't erode. He engaged in unauthorized archaeological digs. But he was a very opinionated, a very strong-headed individual whose principal concern as you watch him mature was to protect the national monuments, sometimes from what he referred to as the Washington bureaucrats or the goofs. And
you're planning on continuing to do some research on him, and maybe we may see a manuscript in the future?
I hope so, you're right, because in 1923, he would be appointed as superintendent of what was called the Southwestern National Monuments, and he would hold that particular position until his death on the 14th of February of 1940, when he died there at Casa Grande delivering a speech. At the time of his death, his domain included 27 national monuments within 4 states.
Well, maybe when we complete a little bit of that research, we can have you come on and tell us a little bit more about him. This is certainly a fascinating area, environmental history, and looking at the developments of national monuments and national parks policies. It's still an ongoing debate today about how these are used.
Right.
And we want to refer our viewers to your work on White Sands. Hopefully they can pick up a copy of this and read a little bit more about these interesting people and some of the policy changes that they bring about. Dietmar Hector-Schneider, thank you for coming in today and sharing a little bit of your work with us. We want to thank you for coming on the program, and hopefully we can have you on again when we have some other work to discuss.
Thank you for inviting me.
And we want to thank all of you as well for joining us today on Along the Rio Grande, and we hope to see you on our next program.